got our first computer at home. And it had dial-up internet, and I'll explain that to anyone in the room who doesn't understand what that is, but it meant you had to make a conscious decision between whether you wanted to be online or on the phone. Almost immediately, I became addicted to The Sims. The Sims was a life simulation computer game where you created an avatar and designed a world for them. You gave them a house and a family and hobbies and a job, and you basically lived the most boring parts of daily life vicariously through this fake character in your screen. It sounds a little bit familiar now that I talk about it. But the fascinating thing was that no matter who was playing, whether it was you or your sibling or a friend or a random cousin who had come from overseas, everyone kind of had the same impulse. It didn't take very long before you put your sim in the pool and you deleted the ladder. Or you put your sim in the kitchen and you started a fire and you deleted the door. And you just kind of wanted to see what happened. And it was funny to see this fake person with their arms above their head flailing and wetting themselves with fear because they weren't real. It was just a game, and it was just meant to be for fun. Almost a quarter of a century later, computers now live in our pockets. We moved on from The Sims, and instead of creating fictional avatars, we now create avatars of ourselves. Social media companies have asked us to do that. And we choose how they look, we choose what their interests are, we choose what they like, what they follow. We curate their identities with posts about pop culture and politics, and we spend so much time with them that they start to feel like us. It's kind of impossible to see where my real self ends and my digital self begins. Aren't they kind of one and the same? It definitely feels like that when it's your avatar. But when we live in an artificial world full of these flattened, two-dimensional characters, the compulsion that so many of us had as teenagers remains. When we see a figure as less than human, it's remarkably easy to destroy it. I've been thinking a lot about The Sims over the last few years while I've been immersed in the world of online pylons or social media backlash, or some people call it cancellation, just the outrage that we perform in the digital sphere. I think it's interesting how we dehumanize each other, how we turn each other into symbols worthy of complete obliteration. I became obsessed with this phenomenon when I was working in digital media. So for 10 years, I worked at Australia's largest independent women's media company. I started as an intern and I ended up being editor-in-chief. I remember quite early on in my career, I was a fairly junior writer in my mid-20s. And one day after work, I went to my parents' place for dinner. And all my siblings were there, one of those rare weeknights where we all decided to have dinner together. And I was standing in the living room, and I could hear the sound of scraping plates and vigorous dinner time conversation coming in through the doorway. And my sister was yelling at me to come and eat because my dinner was getting cold. And I couldn't. I was just frozen. Alone with my phone in that living room, I pressed play on a voice note I had just been sent by a stranger. It was the latest in a string of messages that were pouring in, each one just landing like a really heavy stone on my chest. A disembodied voice suddenly emerged from my hands, and it came out like a hiss. This woman, whose social media profile had no identifiable name or photo, said that I was sick and disgusting and that I should be ashamed. She wanted me to retract a story that I had written, and it had unexpectedly offended a small but very, very loud group of people online. The nuances of what that story was about are far too complex and boring to explain here, but I will tell you it was about reality television. So it wasn't exactly life or death. I ended up just deleting it, which is one of the benefits of working in the digital sphere. The downside, however, is that when you make a mistake, the scale of feedback is enormous. The anger then metastasizes, and there's disinhibition in an online space, so people are cooler and they're more frenzied, and they're just angrier than they would ever be in real life. That evening, I got the kinds of messages that burned themselves into my memory. People just saying the worst things that you can imagine saying about someone. There were people who had hundreds of thousands of followers who posted my face and my name and accused me of having very, very sinister intentions with what I'd written. People called me a joke. They said I was gross. They went through old photos of me and commented on my appearance, which I thought was kind of counterintuitive to the feminist argument they were making, but it hurt all the same. I was really, really embarrassed and ashamed, and I felt profoundly alone, even though I was a few feet away from my family, who knew that I wasn't any of the things that I was being called online. I remember being so convinced that if I could just explain myself better, and if I could just say to these people, oh, there's been a misunderstanding, you've thought that I'm someone that I'm not actually a monster, that everything would actually be fine. I now know, years and years later, that that is a futile goal. The internet/social media is not the space to have a nuanced, thoughtful conversation where both sides consider each other's humanity and accept that we're all flawed, vulnerable individuals who, for the most part, are doing our best with what we know. The tone of debate has slipped into one of utter contempt, where we think that if somebody disagrees with us, they are fundamentally morally inferior and they are worthy of name-calling and mocking and humiliation. We don't care if our words hurt them. We don't care if they're suffering. We don't care about their mental health. Listening to that angry voice at my parents' place was one of the moments that really inspired my passion for this, because I was confused about whether it was just me. Was I really, really oversensitive? Maybe I needed to become more self-actualized to not care what strangers said about me. Or was it that it is completely human to seek to be understood, and we have a visceral reaction to feeling like we are being excommunicated from our own community? In researching my novel, The Worst Thing I've Ever Done, I spoke to public figures who had experienced the kind of social media backlash most of us could not even imagine. I spoke to journalists and television personalities and podcast hosts and comedians and actors, all these people who had had their reputations irreparably damaged by online anger. In some cases, they had made identifiable mistakes that they owned. They'd made a mistake at work, they posted an offensive picture perhaps, or they'd used the wrong language, or they'd laughed along to a joke while they were being recorded when they probably should have challenged it. They had done things that they had apologised for. Then there was pylons where there seemed to be a different kind of genesis, where it was less clear-cut. So it might be that a person was perceived to have profited off an element of their identity and that didn't feel like it was deserved. Or a joke that they told a decade earlier had been unearthed and then judged in a context that didn't exist when they originally said it. Regardless of what triggered the outrage, the emotional experience for these people was eerily similar. They told me that they hated themselves more than any of the people condemning them. They told me that they were embarrassed, they wanted to disappear, they didn't want to leave their homes. They questioned every part of who they were and what value they could possibly add to society. But the people I spoke to were also really, really angry. They saw profound unfairness in how they were treated. They saw that perhaps they, as a woman, had been destroyed for a thoughtless mistake, shafted from the kinds of media roles that are currently occupied by men who are being found guilty of domestic violence. Their mental health plunged to depths they'd never experienced. One woman told me that her parents took turns sleeping outside her bedroom door because they were so scared of her risk of suicide. Another very well-known personality told me that when she was being attacked online, she reached out to another high-profile person who was orchestrating the attack and said, "I'm sorry, I did the wrong thing, I'm not okay, can you please allow me some grace, I'm not okay." And that person ignored the message and kept posting. That feeling of being cast out, excommunicated, of being this metaphorical scapegoat, driven out of the village, is, in our evolutionary history, tantamount to death. So perhaps it's no wonder that people have such a deep, profound emotional experience when they feel it. Many of these public figures told me that they would never go on the record to tell their stories. They said it would just reignite the spectacle and they simply could not handle that. But recently, my book came out. I feel like there's been a bit of a cultural shift and something has changed. Several have been willing to share their stories, to have a conversation about the way we engage with each other online and where it leaves us. They spoke to me for The Pylon, a podcast about what happens when the internet turns on you. I've been surprised by the fact that even when I was so sure that the person I was about to interview would be unlikable, they always challenged me. I would go to meet someone and think, I disagree with what you did, I know what you're accused of, I've heard you speak, I've read what you wrote. And when you sit opposite them, you always learn that there is context, that there's a story. And there was a human being opposite me who just wasn't the two-dimensional figure that the internet had turned them into. It's almost impossible to hate someone when you can reach out and touch them. It's far easier to want to hurt them, to want to destroy them, when they're a moving image behind a pane of glass, when they're a character in a tiny computer, like when we used to play The Sims. I have a theory about what's happening when we join the mob during an online pylon. I think often we're really trying to do something good. I think we're trying to prosecute really thorny moral questions, to figure out what's right and wrong, who we are and who we are not. We used to do that with our communities. We used to do that maybe in church, or we used to sit in huge groups and have conversations, philosophical conversations about what made us good and bad. But now I think that we're trying to answer that question and figure out who we are with this thing full of avatars pretending to be people. We're constantly prosecuting morality through the prism of a flattened, uploaded person, conflating individuals with ideology, with sexism and misogyny and bigotry and racism, so it then follows that by destroying them, we're fighting against that social ill. If I can dehumanize a person who said a sexist thing, if I can perform my hatred for them, then I'm making the world a better place. But there's two problems with that. One is that a person is not an ideology, as convenient as that would be. People change, people are complex. That's the great thing about being human. And the second thing is we've seen that shame doesn't change behaviour. You can't shame somebody into agreeing with you. It pushes us further to the extremes and it fosters division. I find now that if I'm incensed by a person I see online, which of course happens, I see people I disagree with, I see people I want to scream at, I imagine what it might be like to sit opposite them, what we might talk about, what we might have in common. I've known and loved enough people who are radically different from me to know that I would probably come to like them. If I gave them a chance, that internet stranger would probably have a lot of redeeming qualities. It's also likely that if the anger and vitriol left the room, and if it was replaced by mutual respect, that we'd learn something really, really important. That speaking to each other and not at each other is the only way that anything is going to change. Thank you.
The event will now take a short intermission.